Description she does of the Portland hospital, the birth, that was completely fabricated. We all know Meghan is a consummate survival actress.
I hope you're having the best birthday you've ever had. Thank you for everything.
Hi, Nanny. I'm English.
The reason why these pictures are so problematic for Meghan Markle is because these pictures place her with Jeffrey Epstein.
Smiley, a person who played with children, Ursula Bolt and the whole thing, into this vengeful person, full of vengeance.
There are so many telltale signs that something is clearly wrong with Meghan. And I don't mean it in a bad way.
And I predicted it in the book, but even I would not have thought it'd be that accelerated. I think personally...
Whoa, okay. The House and Habit bombshell investigation into Meghan Markle is close to dropping. Lauren, the insider, is with me now.
She's a con artist. It was really important to me. I remember where I come from.
It's going to be explosive.
I tried so hard.
Lauren, I've been speaking to Jessica Reed-Krause for many months, and always keeps the receipts. And for some time, she has been promising major revelations to come on Meghan Markle, on Meghan Markle's past. And what we've seen overnight, Lauren, in a series of Instagram stories which precede what the investigation will reveal is quite something. So I think we should go through it, Lauren, and then we'll discuss what this is potentially going to mean. So,
Well, to be rude to the Queen. What was spiteful was that she married into the royal family not so long ago.
but I have to just say, anyone who has doubted me over the past decade about this evil woman now needs to eat some humble pie.
Meghan is at the bottom of the barrel.
In fact, I've seen the tapes. I've got them somewhere. God knows where now. I've got them on
So you'll
some
see
old...
Nudie Rudy Meghan too.
I've seen more than one thing.
There is a detail from Meghan Markle's past that has never quite been put to rest. Not because it is the most dramatic thing ever written about her, not because it represents the defining chapter of who she is or who she became, but because it sits in a particular kind of silence. The silence of something that has been mentioned, briefly acknowledged, and then carefully steered away from in almost every major profile, documentary, and authorized account of her life before Harry. Tom Bower is no longer steering away from it, and the specific details he is now putting on the record about what he calls Meghan's yacht past have produced a reaction that, honestly, tells its own story. Not from the people who have always been critical of her, their response was predictable and immediate, but from people who have spent years defending her, people who have given her every reasonable benefit of every reasonable doubt, people who are now, quietly and with obvious discomfort, saying that some of what Bower is describing deserves a more direct answer than it has received. If you have followed Meghan's story from the beginning, and many of you watching have followed the royal family for far longer than that, long enough to remember what scrutiny of a royal partner looked like before the age of social media, then you will know that separating genuine revelation from orchestrated character attack has become one of the most difficult tasks in following this particular story honestly. Today, we are going to try to do exactly that. If this is the kind of royal coverage you have been looking for, careful, fair, and genuinely respectful of your intelligence, I would warmly invite you to subscribe before we go any further. What we try to do here is give you the full picture rather than just the loudest version of it. Let's begin where Bower begins, with a world that most people who now follow Meghan Markle have largely forgotten she was ever part of. Before the royal family, before Suits, before the humanitarian work and the Netflix documentaries, and the carefully constructed public identity that the world now recognizes, there was a younger Meghan Markle navigating the particular landscape of early career Hollywood with a combination of ambition, charm, and strategic intelligence that everyone who knew her during that period, friends and critics alike, consistently describes as one of her defining characteristics. That landscape, for a young woman of her background and her looks and her aspirations, included spaces that the later, royal-adjacent version of her story has tended to gloss over. Social circuits that operated by their own rules, events and environments where proximity to wealth and influence was both the currency and the commodity. where the line between professional networking and something less easily categorized was not always clearly drawn and was not always meant to be. The yacht world that Bauer is describing existed at the intersection of all of those things. And this is the part that most people missed. The specific circuit Bauer references, the world of high-end yacht events connected to major film festivals, most notably Cannes, was not, in the early 2010s, a secret. It was not hidden. It was a known feature of the entertainment industry landscape, discussed openly in trade publications, referenced in memoirs, and understood by anyone working in that world as one of the places where careers could be accelerated by the right encounter with the right person at the right moment. Young actresses attended these events. Wealthy men hosted them. The dynamics involved were not always straightforward and were not always comfortable, and the women who moved through those spaces did so with varying degrees of agency, varying degrees of awareness of what was expected of them, and varying degrees of power to define the terms of their own participation. Bauer's account places Meghan within that world during a specific period of her career. He does so with what he describes as sourced, documented detail, accounts from people who were present, who observed, and who have spoken to him on the record or with sufficient corroboration to satisfy his journalistic standards. What he is not saying, and this distinction matters enormously and deserves to be stated clearly, is that Meghan did anything illegal. He is not making that claim. He is not suggesting criminal conduct of any kind. What he is describing is participation in a social and professional circuit that carried its own ethical complexity, and he is arguing that the distance between that participation and the public persona Meghan has subsequently constructed is significant enough to warrant examination. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the most interesting response to Bauer's account has not come from Meghan's formal communications team. It has come from women, specifically from women who have direct experience of the entertainment industry during the period Bauer is describing, and whose reaction to Bauer's framing of Meghan's participation in that world is considerably more complicated than either straightforward condemnation or straightforward defense. Several commentators, women with industry backgrounds speaking from direct experience rather than speculation, have pushed back on what they describe as the implicit judgment in Bauer's account, not on the facts of Meghan's presence in those spaces, but on the moral weight Bauer attaches to that presence. Their argument goes something like this. The yacht circuit at Cannes and similar events was not a space that young actresses entered innocently and left compromised. It was a space that the industry itself created, maintained, and directed ambitious young women toward as a legitimate pathway to professional advancement. The responsibility for whatever happened in those spaces does not rest primarily with the women who navigated them. It rests with the structures that made navigating them a rational professional choice. That argument is not without substance, and it is one that Bauer's account, in the view of some serious critics, does not adequately engage with. What nobody talked about at the time was the broader context of what the entertainment industry looked like for young women during the specific years Bauer is describing. This was the pre-Me Too era. The structures of power that have since been partially exposed and partially dismantled were, during that period, largely intact and largely invisible to public scrutiny. The environments Bauer describes were environments in which young women had significantly less agency than the language of individual choice and personal ambition suggests. The decisions made within those environments were made within constraints that the later moral framing tends to flatten out of the picture. None of that is a defense of anything specific that Bauer alleges, but it is context that any honest account of this period requires, and its absence from his framing is something that his more thoughtful critics have consistently identified as the central weakness of his approach. So where does that leave us with the specific details he is now putting on record? Bauer claims, drawing on what he describes as multiple sources with direct knowledge, that Meghan's participation in the yacht circuit during her pre-fame years was more sustained and more deliberate than the carefully curated narrative of her early life suggests. He describes specific events, specific encounters, and a pattern of attendance at these gatherings that he argues reflects a strategic calculation about how to advance her career rather than the incidental social presence she has implied in her own accounts. He further claims that people within her circle during that period have described conversations about the value of these connections, about the opportunities they represented, about how to manage them, that sit uncomfortably alongside the image of the person she later became publicly. These are serious claims. They deserve serious evaluation. And that evaluation requires holding two things simultaneously: the possibility that Bauer's sourcing is accurate and that his account reflects something real about that period of Meghan's life, and the reality that Bauer is not a neutral biographer. His previous work on Meghan has attracted significant criticism, not all of it partisan, for a pattern of presenting the least charitable interpretation of ambiguous evidence as the most credible one, for treating the gap between Meghan's public presentation and more complicated private realities as evidence of calculated deception, rather than the ordinary human complexity that most people's lives contain. That pattern does not make him wrong about everything, but it is a pattern that requires the careful reader to do their own work, rather than simply receiving his conclusions. What does Meghan's team say in response to these specific claims? The answer, as of this recording, is that there has been no detailed, point-by-point rebuttal of the specific details Bauer has put on record. There has been a general statement dismissing his work as part of a documented pattern of hostile coverage. There have been references to his previous publications and the criticisms they attracted, but the specific claims, the names, the dates, the events, the conversations his sources describe, have not been addressed directly and in detail. That silence has a quality to it that is difficult to ignore, not because silence equals guilt, it does not, and it is important to say that plainly, but because the pattern of response from Meghan's team to serious sourced allegations has consistently been the same: general dismissal rather than specific rebuttal, characterization of the source rather than engagement with the substance, and a reliance on the sympathy of supporters rather than the provision of contradicting evidence. That pattern raises questions, not about what happened on those yachts, but about how Meghan and her team have chosen to manage the distance between the life she lived and the narrative she has subsequently constructed around it. And that detail matters more than it first appears, because the narrative Meghan has constructed of a self-made woman of principle who sacrificed comfort and security for integrity, who walked away from wealth and privilege because the cost to her soul was too high, is a narrative that draws its power from a particular kind of moral consistency, from the sense that the person presenting it has always, even in the difficult early years, made choices that reflect the values she now publicly champions. If the picture Bauer is painting is accurate, even partially accurate, it complicates that narrative in ways that cannot be entirely resolved by pointing at the flaws in his character or his motivation. Because a narrative's vulnerability to complication is not created by the people who point at the complications. It is created by the gap itself, by the distance between the story that was told and the life that was actually lived. Every public figure manages that gap. Every person who has ever constructed a public identity has made choices they would prefer not to be the defining story of who they are. That is not unique to Meghan Markle. It is the human condition operating at an unusual scale and under unusual scrutiny. The question Bauer is effectively posing, and it is worth separating the question from the questioner, because the question has merit even when the questioner has an agenda, is whether the specific nature of the gap in this case is significant enough to require a more honest reckoning than has so far been offered. There is a moment in Bauer's account that I have found myself returning to, Not the most dramatic claim, not the most salacious detail, but a quieter observation about the women around Meghan during that period. The friends, the acquaintances, the fellow travelers through the same circuit, and the different trajectories their lives have taken since. Some of them have spoken publicly, in the post-Me Too landscape, about what those years were actually like, about the pressures, the calculations, the moments where the cost of ambition became visible in ways that could not be entirely managed. Their accounts are not accounts of victimhood exactly, but they are accounts of complexity, of choices made within constraints, of a world that looked like opportunity, and sometimes was something else wearing opportunity's clothes. Meghan has not spoken in those terms about that period of her life. She has presented her early career as a straightforward story of hard work and resilience, of a woman who knew what she wanted and pursued it with determination and integrity. That version may be true, it may be the accurate account, or it may be one layer of a more textured truth that the public story has not yet found the language to carry. Only Meghan knows which. And this is where I want to offer something that I think often gets lost in the noise of this particular conversation. Meghan Markle was a young woman trying to build a career in one of the most competitive, and we now know, one of the most predatory industries on Earth. Whatever choices she made during that period, she made them as a young person with limited power, in a world structured by the power of others. The moral weight of those choices, if moral weight is the appropriate frame at all, belongs primarily with the structures and the people who created the conditions in which those choices had to be made. She went on to build something remarkable. Whatever the complications of her royal years and her post-royal reinvention, the work she has done on mental health advocacy, on humanitarian causes, on the representation of women whose stories have historically been marginalized, that work is real. Its impact is documented. It reflects values that, whatever the inconsistencies in the surrounding narrative, appear to be genuinely held. A person is not reducible to the most vulnerable chapter of their life, especially when that chapter unfolded in circumstances not of their making. Tom Bower would not agree with that framing. He would say that the choices made in those years reveal something essential and not yet publicly accounted for, that the distance between the yacht circuit and the humanitarian platform is a distance that deserves honest examination rather than protective silence. He may have a point, and so may the people who argue that his framing of that distance reflects something about how we judge ambitious women that we do not apply with equal rigor to ambitious men who moved through exactly the same spaces during exactly the same years. Both things can be true simultaneously, that Bower is raising questions worth asking, and that his way of asking them carries a bias that shapes the answers he finds. Where does that leave us? It leaves us, as the story so often does, in the complicated middle ground between the version that confirms what her critics have always believed and the version that confirms what her supporters have always believed. The ground where the actual truth of a human life tends to live. Messy, contextual, resistant to the clean verdicts that make good headlines but poor history. Meghan Markle was a young woman with ambition and intelligence and a set of circumstances she navigated as best she could with the tools available to her. She became a public figure of extraordinary global profile. She has told a version of her own story, as all of us tell versions of our own stories, that emphasizes what she is most proud of and passes more quickly over what she is not. Tom Bower is insisting on slowing down in the places she moves quickly through. Whether that insistence is in the service of truth or in the service of something less honorable, that is a question each viewer will have to answer for themselves, based on what they know of the man, what they know of the woman, and what they know of the world that shaped them both. I would genuinely love to know what you think, not about who is right or wrong, but about the harder question underneath all of it. How much of our past are we obliged to carry publicly, and at what point does the distance between who we were and who we become not a contradiction to be exposed, but simply the evidence of a life honestly lived? Leave your thoughts below. These are exactly the conversations worth having, and this, as always, is the space where we try to have them properly.